In this roundup of a week, protests against coronavirus lockdown are happening across the world. Bill Gates has been named as the target for most coronavirus conspiracy theories, and 56 scientists, including prominent climate scientists, send an open letter to endorse Joe Biden and condemn Donald Trump as anti-science. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the faintly disappointing dystopian movie that is 2020. I hope you're well and dodging the bugs. And it's fair to say that the certainty of the early days of coronavirus lockdown is giving way to waves of soul searching as various difficult possibilities present themselves. The first is that more people may die as a result of the current actions than would have done without lockdown. So, for instance, one consultant oncologist, Carol Sikora, wrote a piece for the UK's Daily Mail suggesting that tunnel vision on COVID-19 runs the risk that 50,000 more people could end up dying of cancer who otherwise might have been saved. Apparently some stroke and heart patients are routinely waiting 2 hours for an ambulance, and obviously for both of those conditions extra time can be fatal. 2,300 cancer diagnoses are being missed per week because patients are not going to see their GPs and not being referred for tests. An additional 400 cancers a week are being missed because breast, cervical and bowel cancer screening has been suspended. And that's ignoring all the people who are living in pain and in distress because all routine operations have been suspended, most dental clinics closed and so on. The suggested 50,000 extra deaths come as a consequence if these conditions should last for another 6 months, which is possible. I'd be cautious with the exact numbers. Individual experts quoted in the popular press hasn't historically been a reliable medium, but there's no doubt that the principle it highlights is absolutely right. There are lots of ways to die. Sorry to point it out. Until recently, COVID-19 wasn't even one of them. Ignoring all the others except COVID-19 is not going to play out well if the objective is supposed to be to save the maximum number of lives possible. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to end lockdown early, but it does mean you have to make certain changes, make certain essential systems able to function again. So, for instance, in the UK, they're now talking about virus-free hubs where other essential procedures are carried out. But it's just another factor that's leading a lot of people to get very itchy about whether the world is doing the right thing and how quickly the current measures need to be relaxed. In countries that have been the hardest hit, such as Italy, Spain, Belgium, the state of New York, there's probably a lot less doubt because those countries have seen desperate hospital workers unable to cope with the flood of cases, shortages of PPE equipment leading to higher fatalities among the doctors and nurses themselves, arguing that they may have overreacted, not a line that's going to carry a lot of credence in those places. And then, of course, every other country will point at those ones and say, we reacted the way we did in order to avoid being like them. It's not that simple, of course. There are multiple factors at play. No two countries are identical. For instance, there are cultural factors that make a big difference that people rarely talk about. Why did Italy and Spain get so heavily hit? One of the factors is that culturally, there's lots of physical contact. One of the factors is that culturally people are less inclined to follow orders, or at least they were in the early days. Both of those could be positive national characteristics under many circumstances, as are closer relationships between extended families. But at the same time, they can also be exacerbating factors in this situation. Why are the worst hit countries in Europe plateauing on 400 or 500 deaths a day, while the UK keeps hitting 600 to 800? I mean, that's a good question. We have to keep reminding ourselves we're dealing with slightly unreliable data. Countries are not measuring the same thing. How the data is collected is haphazard. The virus in Sweden probably doesn't decide to kill fewer people at the weekends, for instance. But nevertheless, the soul searching about how quickly we can get out of this intensified this week. In some areas, that's spilling over into unrest. More US states have seen lockdown protests, particularly in states where there are Democratic governors. Although they seem to be organised by certain mainstream conservative groups, they've attracted some of the more fringe groups as well. So there are plenty dismissing them as far-right actions. In France, there's been violence, with gangs of youth protesting on locked down estates, and protests also from over 70s. who fear being locked down by law for an indefinite period of time, even as everyone else starts to emerge. Protesters in Berlin have defied a ban on demonstrations in Germany to push the case that lockdown and social distancing measures were unreasonable. And bear in mind, Germany is a country that's been lauded by everyone else because of how effective it's been. In India, thousands of stranded migrant workers caused chaos in Mumbai after lockdown provisions were extended there. Generally, these are minority actions. You wouldn't say that the public resolve overall was disintegrating anywhere just yet. Even though the US protests have made the most headlines, recent polling there does suggest that there remains a strong bipartisan support amongst Americans for stay-at-home orders and social distancing. And maybe those fringe complaints will remain just that. More important than the protests, perhaps, are the voices being raised to argue with the rationale of lockdown in the first place. So, of course, the Oncologist talking about cancer deaths is being amplified. Toby Young, who recently set up a lockdown critics website, showed this comparison of the death rate curve in Sweden, where there's been no lockdown, scaled up to compare with the same curve of the UK, pointing out that they're pretty identical and implying that therefore the lockdown hasn't made a difference in the UK. Now, of course, everyone's making the comparison that best suits their argument. Skeptics are heralding the example of Sweden, but critics on the other side are comparing everyone to Germany, to New Zealand and to South Korea. All of them ignoring the multiple factors that make such countries different to the rest. And indeed, ignoring the fact that it ain't over yet. And we don't know the final position until we get to the end of the movie. One thing we discovered is that a lot of dealing with this situation is to cope with a disintegration of global norms of cooperation and to understand that efficient execution is absolutely key to scaling up. This has come into focus because of the global nightmare that has been personal protective equipment, PPE, as every country scrabbles to get hold of as much PPE as possible for their health workers, and the global market has been described as descending into a wild west. Former orders have been ignored, someone's just swooped in with a higher offer. Orders in transit have been hijacked and rerouted. Suppliers and middlemen have been price gouging. A number of governments have banned the export of PPE so they can be routed to their own services. And none of that's been helped by the fact that governments are really just not good at this. Military personnel brought in to help out the UK National Health Service criticised the NHS for its appalling handling of distributing PPE. The NHS is great at some things, but like many public service agencies, logistics, fast-moving and efficiency isn't amongst them. It has massively dedicated frontline staff, putting their lives in danger daily to give people the care they need, but is let down by a bureaucracy that has been completely incapable of adjusting fast enough for the scale of the challenge. The service is getting through nearly 500,000 gowns per day, which is huge. Government's been inundated with offers from companies to supply equipment, but those companies are not hearing back for weeks. Critics will, of course, blame the government of the day for it. And, yes, everyone has to be held accountable. But the truth is the public sector generally isn't great at this stuff and never has been. It's the reason why when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005, Walmart, not the federal government, was the one that emerged with credit for mobilising resources at scale and at speed into the stricken area. One thing we may have learned from all of this is we need good systems in place for future pandemics. And because governments are not good at being the direct providers of those systems, maybe we should welcome some of the support and help of the people who made fortunes based on business models that use the power of technology to solve such problems in ever smarter ways. And then, once we've attracted the support of those people, obviously, we can then blame them for the problems. At least that's the exciting experiment we seem to be trying at the moment. This week it came to light that Microsoft founder and global philanthropist Bill Gates has achieved the dubious distinction of being the most frequently targeted for coronavirus conspiracy theories of anyone else on the planet. Because of course, here you have someone who's been doing more than almost anyone else in recent years to warn people about the prospect of a forthcoming pandemic, who has sunk major quantities of money into helping address it. Let's pick that guy out and blame the whole thing on him. Because the internet, it turns out, is Mao's cultural revolution for the world. We now routinely denounce people for whatever nonsensical crimes have entered our heads. Never mind the billionaires who made their money through businesses that have no brand presence on the high street and who we've never heard of. You know, the ones that have not spent billions of dollars trying to eradicate diseases in developing countries, that have not largely spent their money to give back to the society that made their success possible. Those guys. And especially, let's ignore the ones who exploit their workers, use their wealth as a badge to do whatever they want for people around them because they can. Those people exist, but we'll ignore those people and we'll go instead for people like Bill Gates who actually care. Because this is the world we live in these days. If you'd asked me 30 years ago, I would have thought it unlikely I would be here mounting a defence of Bill Gates. I was an Apple man. Microsoft was the evil empire, the bewilderingly widespread tidal wave of mediocrity, the monopolist brought to heel by regulators for abusing its position to force people to use really bad Internet Explorer browsers rather than Netscape Navigator. Any web designer who lived through the period where you had to do multiple style sheet variations to cope with the quirks of Internet Explorer 7 and then a bunch of different quirks for Internet Explorer 8, none of those people loved Bill Gates. But so what? He made his money by being smart and being highly competitive, and then having shown that the smart application of technology could create highly successful businesses, he saw the billions of dollars he'd accumulated and decided that maybe the same smart approach could help solve problems that businesses wouldn't address left to their own devices. When he appeared on Stephen Colbert a while ago, he was asked, shouldn't billionaires just pay more tax? He said yes, they should, and pointed to the tax proposals he'd advocated for that. But then he added, that should be in addition to philanthropy, because he was in a position to be able to use some of his money to fund speculative initiatives that would not be appropriate uses of taxpayer dollars. And it's a solid point. Take the pandemic, for instance. There's a race to find a vaccine. Once we found it, one of the challenges will be to scale up its production fast enough to meet world demand, which you'd expect to be brisk, to say the least. Gates is building some of the highly specialised factories for different approaches now, knowing full well that most of those approaches will turn out not to be viable, and therefore the money for those factories will be wasted. But the ones that do turn out to be viable will have a head start in production. Now, what other process is going to invest in that way? Now, nobody should be put on a pedestal. Human beings are flawed. Bill Gates seems pretty grounded, maybe because he's already experienced hubris in his business career and he's now seeing beyond it. Maybe because he has an equal partnership with Melinda Gates and they keep each other real. Who knows? But since the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was set up 20 years ago, it has had a reputation for being ambitious, aiming for the total elimination of certain diseases, for instance. It's smart. They visit the people on the ground, find out the issues and support them. They try to take an entrepreneurial approach to spending the money to make it more effective. They fund research and make the results open access so that everyone could benefit from the peer-reviewed research and the underlying data that informed it. And they focused on diseases that kill lots of people in poorer countries, where the market incentives don't reward investment by the traditional pharmaceutical business model. Diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis. They look at basic nutrition, basic sanitation, agricultural development, family planning, basic healthcare, all key areas that most affect how people live their lives and more often how they end up losing their lives early. Such activity led conspiracy theorist David Icke to comment thusly.
Bill Gates' money is everywhere over this whole virus thing and vaccines in general. How many people realize that the second biggest funder of the World Health Organization, second only to the government of the United States, is Bill Gates? He owns the place. Who's been driving the policy reacting to this alleged virus? The World Health Organization. In other words, Bill Gates, who's just a gopher for people deeper in the cult.
Yes, indeed, David. Bill Gates' money is everywhere trying to make the world a better place. What was your contribution again?
Bill Gates may be the most hated person, or most despised person, I should say, in the world at this point, due to this pushback, due to all of this being exposed by yourself.
Oh yeah, solid job. Thanks, David. So what is the conspiracy that Gates is meant to be at the heart of? Well, it partly comes down to the fact he did a TED talk in 2015 where he warned us that we weren't prepared for the next pandemic. And what he predicted with that pandemic turned out to be right. So obviously that means he must have caused it somehow. His TED talk was the equivalent of the supervillain who has the hero tied up and reveals all of his nefarious plans because he's so proud of himself.
Huh? Oh, come on! You gotta admit this is cool!
A bunch of the anti-vaxxers have dived in, seeing Gates' attempts to help us develop a vaccine to protect people against COVID-19 as being demonstrably evil in its own right. Some people suggest he's aiming to put microchips into people so they can be tracked, and that his secret plan is population reduction because the lizard people told him to, or something. I decided I was going to talk about this when I looked at Gates' YouTube channel. His latest video is one drawing attention to one of the remarkable people on the front line, Kapana Mabazo, who runs the Grow Great campaign to help stunted children in South Africa. Stunting in children is a major consequence of poverty. This woman, a doctor and a novelist, is trying to eliminate stunting from South Africa over the next decade. Important issue, amazing story. And the comments underneath the video were amongst the most awful car crash of humanity I have ever seen. I mean, I get some salty comments on this channel. The worst of them just make me chuckle. These were something else. Seriously, it just makes me want to bash my head against the table over and over again. According to some sources, such a phenomenon isn't random chance. The US State Department reported this week that Chinese, Russian and Iranian agents have been involved spreading claims about the pandemic. The European External Action Service reached similar conclusions in relation to Russia and China, both of whom are linked with the Bill Gates targeted conspiracies, apparently. Such efforts could not bear fruit, of course, if there wasn't a highly receptive people waiting to give outlandish claims credibility. It seems that in the era of polarised democracies and instant social media messaging, this is the front for the new Cold War. I mean, isn't it? Because if authoritarian governments are deliberately sowing discord and disinformation, isn't that a hostile act close to what you expect as an act of war? And, it's highly effective. Because in a politically polarised society, no government will be given licence to take robust action in response. I can't help but think this is going to be a major factor over the coming couple of decades. Now, maybe at some point all the leaders of these countries will realise that we all live on the same planet, and therefore we should play nice. And if that was going to happen, perhaps this would be the week, because this week we saw the annual Earth Day, which unsurprisingly didn't get the profile that perhaps it has tended to in previous years. However, one thing that did happen was that to mark the occasion, a group of 56 scientists released a letter endorsing Joe Biden as a presidential candidate and slamming Donald Trump. They wrote this: Vice President Biden has long trusted the scientific consensus on climate change and for more than 30 years has advanced policies to support scientific research and slow climate change. We are confident that, unlike President Trump, Joe Biden will respect, collaborate with and listen to leaders in the scientific community and public health experts to confront the existential climate crisis and other environmental threats. They had more to say about their displeasure with the Trump administration. President Trump's own administration released a national climate assessment with contributions from 300 scientists, including many of us, warning that climate change could cost America hundreds of billions of dollars per year by the end of the century. Regrettably, President Trump's response to the report was, "I don't believe it." Worse, Trump has repeatedly suppressed science and silenced scientists. His administration has scrubbed federal websites of references to climate change and forced researchers to truncate forecasts from scientific models investigating the dire consequences of climate change. He has barred widely respected scientists from sitting on the Environmental Protection Agency's Scientific Advisory Board, sought to block the use of relevant scientific research in making federal regulations, and even defunded critical research about how high levels of pollution impact the healthy development of children. They then finish with their final rallying cry: now more than ever, the United States needs a president who trusts and respects scientists and will confront the climate crisis head on. At that stage, I'm guessing half of you are punching the air and shouting, "Hey yeah!" and the other half are looking possibly for something else to punch. Most of you know that I believe in following the science, and that I believe we need to take concrete action on climate change. And now I'm going to tell you I think this letter is a huge mistake. It's not that there are no grounds for such sentiments. Only just a couple of days ago, the US doctor overseeing research for a coronavirus vaccine said that he'd been forced out of his job for questioning President Trump's insistence that hydroxychloroquine could be a game changer. The president ordered 29 million doses to be bought, but testing now shows that it's not effective. Focusing on such mistakes is fair game. And the day before shooting this video, the president asked aloud at a press conference, possibly aiming to drum up business for the Darwin Award, whether people should inject disinfectant to fight coronavirus. Let's just say the science and medicine is not the president's strong area. But does that mean that the scientific community becomes a partisan player in its own right? Don't get me wrong, these 56 individuals can campaign for whoever they want in a personal capacity. It's every citizen's right, and good luck to them. And they say that they signed the letter in their personal capacity, not representing their institution, which of course is right and proper, but nevertheless they sign it as a group of scientists, self-proclaimed, speaking as the voice of science to acclaim one side and criticise the other. Nobody elected them to this role. What they're now doing is seeking to throw the weight of science behind one political persuasion. Now they may say all they're doing is judging individual candidates on their individual merits in relation to their policies relation to science. They're not generalising about Democrats and Republicans, just about Biden and Trump. And do we think that distinction matters one jot as to how their message is going to be received by the respective audiences on both sides? By painting yourself as the determined enemy of one side's candidate, do you not think that you widen the gulf between you and the supporters of that candidate? By associating science, which is about observed reality, with one side of a political divide, do you think you're doing science a favour? By accusing one side of refusing to listen to science that it doesn't like, are you really suggesting there's no history of that happening on the other side? By saying that politicians must do as scientists say or else suffer condemnation, do you think you might be confusing the science of how things are with the politics of public policy? I mean, just in principle, whether you like what Trump is doing or not, it's not the role of political leaders only to do what you, the scientists, tell them to do. The Paris Agreement on climate change has a number of flaws. Maybe it is the only game in town. Maybe pulling out was a big mistake. Maybe in the world of global diplomacy, there are trade-offs that may not be obvious to you from where you sit. Whether it's a mistake or not, it's not your decision. Like I say, every citizen's entitled to a political opinion and to become an activist for them, should they so wish. But there's a difference between that and bringing science itself into the frame as an activist that takes a position on individual policy proposals and treaties. There's a difference between that and giving up on all possibilities of creating a better understanding with an individual leader and the science, because you've burned bridges with that leader by utilising the science as a weapon against them. It's just bad campaign strategy if your goal is to get public policy informed by the science. Really, it is. Do you know how you influence people? Not by saying, listen to what we say or else. Generally not. People in businesses that have had the sustainability brief have found a more successful approach is to go to the various heads of department within the business and ask, tell me what your priorities are. Let's work out how the sustainability brief can help you to meet them. Because let's be clear, it's not beyond the bounds of human ingenuity to work out how a different approach to the science could help Trump to meet his personal objectives and his administration's political objectives, if you take the time to properly understand them. And I say that because generally people on the left completely fail to understand them. When Trump was elected, we were told he was literally Hitler. And he's been many things since he was elected. He's been given plenty of grounds for complaint. But no, he has not been literally Hitler. When you misunderstand what actually drives people at such a profound level, then it's going to get in the way of achieving your goal. Even if you're actually a politician and your goal is defeating the other guy. Because the Democrats tried to win the last election by telling the electorate that Trump was literally Hitler. And he got elected anyway. How could that be? How could the American public elect Hitler? And the answer, of course, is because your attacks that were based on that premise didn't carry credibility with people who weren't already bought into your ideological worldview. It's down to you whether you learn from that mistake or whether you repeat it. Right now, I have to say it's not looking too good. We see the New Zealand Prime Minister praised for taking robust action, including lockdown on entry into the country, and we see Trump vilified for enacting a temporary halt to immigration into the US. People who are not knee-deep in ideology notice such inconsistencies. In any case, nobody elected 56 people to drag the whole of science onto the battlefield, whichever side you're on. I would recommend against this in principle. All right, that's all we've got time for this week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.